Hey everyone, welcome back to another recap video from my National Open tournament in Vegas. It's been a few weeks since the tournament is finished, and I've still been kind of reflecting on my games, doing some analysis. And in this video, I want to share two games. And I actually played in back-to-back rounds, brother and then sister. One of the best brother-sister duos in the country, Derek Wu and Rochelle Wu, both national masters, both a little bit lower rated than me, but still tough opponents. And now we'll focus on this first game against Derek. And this is a name that you might recognize. He is a streamer on Twitch, and he made a pretty notable appearance in one of my most popular YouTube uploads ever. Video Everyone Falls for this new opening trap. He was actually the person who led me on to this England Gambit Bishop C5 trap. If I just play a brief
Derek.
moment. Yeah, this guy.
Let's do this. Fall for it. Daniel, fall for it! Daniel!
Yep. So anyway, I knew he's a very active online blitz and bullet player, one of the founding fathers of this England Gambit trap. So I do owe him a lot of credit for being one of the first people to discover that trap. And I had the black pieces against him, and he played d4 on move 1. Now, before the game, I didn't really have much time to prepare, but I knew I wasn't going to play any dubious gambit, especially England Gambit. If I played this against him, uh, it's just too much of a risk in classical chess, and I would have very quickly gotten a just worse position. So I stuck with my main repertoire, played a Queen's Gambit declined, and I managed to surprise him relatively early as move 4. I played pawn a6, which is a move I don't think I've ever played before in tournament chess, but I've played similar ideas. Sometimes I play a6 later on. I have a decent number of games after bishop e7, bishop g5, castle e3, and then a6. But the point of playing a6 in these sort of structures is to prepare pawn takes pawn, and then the eventual b5, bishop e7, c5, and get the early expansion on the queen side. And this is something that's been trendy in recent years. Even at the highest levels, Magnus Carlsen has been known for playing this move in this position, but also in positions like this. A6 is becoming more acceptable these days. So when I played a6 in the game, Derek took a somewhat of a think, and then played pawn to c5, which normally isn't that great. Like in Queen's Gambit, usually you should leave the tension, but because I played a6, white is trying to punish me as much as possible, also preventing me from taking and playing b5 and getting a nice open position. So I went ahead, I played b6, which is kind of the thematic move. And I should note here that it's not great for white to play b4, even though this looks pretty consistent with the plans, because after a5, the pawns are kind of falling apart. White can't play a3 because takes and there's a pin. And if takes on b6, I would take on b4. And black is just getting the upper hand here. So here my opponent took on b6. And this is where I think I made one of my biggest mistakes of the game, surprisingly enough. I went ahead, I just automatically recaptured without almost any thought, because I thought this was my only logical move. And then after the game, it was actually Derek who told me that I have another option here that didn't even cross my mind. So I'll pose this as an exercise for viewers. Black to move. What's the other candidate move apart from pawn takes pawn? Feel free to pause the video if you can't immediately see it. But the move I should have considered, and if I did consider it, I probably would have played it, is pawn c5, which is actually a pretty stylish move. First of all, white can't en passant. I know maybe some people are just learning the rules of en passant. You can only en passant when there's a pawn on the 5th rank, not on the 6th rank. So if you're still confused, you can Google it. But the benefit of pawn c5 is that I want to recapture with the queen, and I want to pressure the center. And essentially, I just want to trade off c pawn for d pawn and get a situation where, let's say, we trade, I'll take back, and I'll have 2 center pawns against 1 center pawn. Now, white would have different ways of responding to this. And if we look at the database, there's been, yeah, there haven't been too many games in master level play, just one, according to Lichess. But we look at the Lichess database, black scores pretty well from this line. And it would have been a nice way to make the position a bit more open, a bit more dynamic. What happened in the game is I took back, and we got a much more symmetrical pawn structure, which made it very, very difficult for me to create like any dynamic play. Now, I felt bad after the game when I realized I could have played c5, but then right before I started recording this video, I actually found a game from Magnus Carlsen that was played a few months ago. He played the same opening against Rajabov. I believe this was back in April. Maybe some kind of Chess 24 event. And they went into the same line, and Magnus also took back on b6. So I guess I can't be too disappointed if I played the same move as Magnus, but given the situation in the game, I was a couple 100 points higher rated. I really should have tried to make things more dynamic. And as we're going to see, with simple development from both sides, it was hard for black to really create much in the position. I had a slightly worse bishop on b7, and the pawns are almost completely symmetrical. So I went with the only plan I could think of is to expand on the queen side with pawn b5. And there's a few ideas with this move. One is to maneuver the knight to c4. Another idea is to eventually play b4 and then a5 and then bishop a6. So very positional play. I'm looking to kind of grab space and make gradual improvements. But my opponent played very solidly, starting with bishop b1, knight b6, knight e5, knight c4, and I got my outpost. I was looking forward to a situation where if white takes, I would take back and have a nice open bishop, nice pawn chain. But then white played knight d3, and it looks like a weird setup, but the knight's relatively well placed on d3, and white wants to give me a taste of my own medicine with some idea of knight c5. So I played knight d7, just controlling c5. b3 was played. And yeah, this is the unfortunate part about my knight being on c4 is it's not technically an outpost. But the benefit after b3, I was able to play knight a3 and get rid of white's bishop. Knight f4, takes b1, takes, and I play a5. So I was really trying to create some imbalance. Managed to get bishop for knight, but it's not a huge type of thing to play for. And what ended up happening in the game honestly wasn't too invigorating. We traded all the rooks, and then eventually we traded the queens. Just because this was the only open file, in order to fight for the file, I had to initiate trades. And then we got to this position, which on the surface it looks completely equal, very close to drawish. I was optimistic that I would have some chances to play for a win, just because these pawns are fixed on light squares. And in my wildest fantasies, I was envisioning getting the bishop to b1, winning all the pawns, and making a queen. Unfortunately, that's very hard to do when the knights are kind of covering the key squares. Next few moves were a matter of improving for both sides. Knight e1 brought my king in, and here the knight found a nice outpost. Um, and this was another key moment in the game. I think this was the second like really big mistake that I made. If you look at this game with the engine, it will say that very few mistakes were made. I don't think any blunders were made. But my next move was incorrect, and I'll pose this as another exercise for viewers. I'm going to give two options here. There's only two candidate moves to consider here. Is bishop coming back to c8 or bishop b5? These should really be the main choices. Some of you might think bishop e2 is also a choice, but this would just run into f3, and then the king will come in, and the bishop doesn't want to go in too far to white's territory. So between bishop b5 and bishop c8, I chose the wrong option. I played bishop b5, which during the time I thought this was the most logical. Of course, I keep the control of this diagonal. I still want to have potential for playing bishop d3 at some point when the knights are not here. The flaw in my thought process was I didn't fully acknowledge my long-term plan and realize how white can counter that plan. Of course, I wanted to execute a plan of king d6, f6, and e5, which I thought would be a nice way to try and destabilize white's setup in the center. The problem with this plan is that there's a very pesky knight to b7 check whenever my king goes to d6. And we're going to see how this plays out. But to make this easier to understand, I should have played bishop to c8, even though this looks really passive. This would have restricted the knight and then allowed me to play this, this, and this. And it would have offered better winning chances. As we see what happens in the game, okay, f4 is played, fine move. I still carry through with, immediately e5. White takes, knight c2. I play king d6. And I have a threat here. I'm threatening to take on d4 and then take again on d4. So if white wastes a move, I can take, and I believe this is winning a pawn because after takes, I'm just up a pawn. And knight b7, I can move here to defend. Maybe it'd still be tricky, but this should be winning for black because after takes, my king will come in. This pawn is passed. These pawns are very weak. So, unfortunately, white has a move here. White doesn't have to waste time with playing h3. Derek pretty quickly played knight b7. I played king c7, and then he repeated. And I realized I'm just not better here. I really want to bring my king in. My other pieces are basically fully optimized. I didn't see a way to play on for a win, so I just repeated, and the game ended in a draw. And I was slightly disappointed afterwards because I felt like I didn't create enough winning chances for myself. But kudos to Derek for playing a relatively mistake-free and clean game. Okay, let's move on to the next game. It was the following day. I played Derek's sister, Rochelle Wu, who I have had a history with. We played once before in 2019, and I have video proof of it. We played in St. Louis at the 2019 Norm Congress. And we had a super long game where she was absolutely crushing me, but somehow I miraculously survived an endgame down 2 pawns. I'll leave a link in the video description in case people want to watch this coverage. There's commentary from Ben Simon and GM Alexander Lenderman. But in Vegas, the situation was different. I managed to avoid getting a losing position. And I do have a story before we actually get into the game. As I arrived for the game, I think I arrived like a couple minutes late. And as I was finding the board, Rochelle had already sat down and was trying to figure out how to set her chess clock. And she didn't know how to, and I didn't know how to set her clock. So we just decided to use my clock. So I quickly set it and put it next to the board. And then I started like writing on my score sheet before we actually started the game. And she gave me this like weird look. And I looked up and I realized that when I set the clock down, her time was running and I hadn't made a move yet. So yeah, usually you should not have your time running when you're black and white hasn't made a move. And she looked at me and she said, I think it's your move. And I realized what was going on and I just reset the clock. But it was a very polite way to handle that situation. Um, so anyway, we started the game. She ended up starting my clock and I played e4. And one of the reasons why I arrived a couple minutes late is because tried to spend as much time as possible preparing for her repertoire. And I knew to look up her previous tournament games and her online games. And I knew that she's a pretty loyal Najdorf player, likes to play Najdorf and not too much else. So I was expecting this position. And I knew she had one game from a few months ago in the variation after pawn d4. And this is a relatively trendy line, especially at the highest level play. Like if you look this up in Masters database, you'll see Caruana, MVL, Carlsen. I believe this position was played in the candidates between Grishuk and MVL. As far as I know, this doesn't have an official name. Lichess just calls this a closed Sicilian. I believe Carlsen was one of the earlier innovators of this variation. And at first, it doesn't seem too logical, because after takes, it seems like black can just play knight c6, and white is wasting time with the queen. But the point of playing this is to go for a setup with queen d2, b3, bishop e2, castling, and then expand on the king side with either f4 or f3 and g4. And we got something very similar in the game. Instead of knight c6, she played a6, perhaps just preventing bishop to b5. I continue, b3, now knight c6, drop back. And she was taking time on every move, so in the opening I was feeling pretty comfortable about the position. Play bishop e2, bishop g7, and castling. So up until this point, I didn't really need to use so much time. And at this point, when I castled, she was away from the board. I think maybe she was checking out other games or maybe getting water. And then a photographer came by. The event had a photographer like taking pictures of all the top boards. So the photographer came like across from me, and I wasn't sure whether to pose for the camera or just try and look candid. But then the photo was posted on Facebook, and I decided to try and smile for the camera. In this photo, I was just smiling with my eyes. So you can see the position here. We can see the clock is set to black to move. And I was trying to look into the camera's soul. Anyway, if people want to see more photos from this event, I'll leave the link to the Facebook album in the video description. So eventually she got back, photographer walked away, and the game continued. She played bishop d7. And in my preparation for this game, I didn't look at this specific position. I just looked at ideas. I saw a lot of like high-level games or like goes for this attack, especially against the Fianchetto setup. But I started thinking in this position because I realized there's a kind of a cool option that I can play, given that black is a little bit slow to develop, hasn't played knight f6 yet. And I went ahead and played knight to d5, which is a very ambitious move. But the point is to slow down black's development. It's now no longer good for black to play knight f6 because I can take, and eventually black will either have to take with pawn, or after takes, I'll win the d6 pawn. So after knight d5, she took on b2, I take back, and now we get a situation where this knight still having trouble developing. Black doesn't necessarily want to play e6 because it's weakening to d6. So I was feeling happy. She played rook c8. I think this is a very reasonable move. And here I went ahead and played h4, going for the immediate flank pawn attack. It's especially effective against the structure. And if black does allow me to play h5, it can cause serious problems, especially with the king still in the center. And for that reason, black played h5, just preventing me from expanding. And here I played queen c3, so trying to keep initiative, hitting the rook, and attempting to force black to make some sort of concession. And there's not too many ways for black to deal with this. A move like rook h7 doesn't make much sense. The rook is ridiculous here, would allow for ideas of eventually knight g5. And a move like knight e5, even though this looks nice, it blocks the attack, it hits the queen, I can respond with queen d4, targeting b6, and also threatening f4 to attack the now pinned knight. So for this reason, she played pawn e5, which is probably the best move in the position, even though it does make a kind of big concession, as it leaves this pawn very backwards, also weakens the d5 square, because now there's no black pawn that can move to e6 to get rid of my knight. So game continues. I play queen e3, idea of targeting b6, and now she plays knight f6, challenging my knight. And I realized that this move is actually a blunder now. If I go for knight b6, looks nice attacking the rook, also attacking the pawn, black would have a nice response, knight g4, counterattack my queen, and there'd be no way to move my queen to still save my knight. So instead of overextending with my knight, I develop another piece, bishop c4, reinforcing the knight. And here she played b5, which I was kind of expecting. Now, during the game, I was a little bit more concerned about knight g4 still. Idea being I would have to retreat with my queen, and then b5, and then I would have to retreat with my bishop. However, after a move like bishop f1, I'd still have good control over the position. In the game, with the immediate b5, I didn't have to retreat my bishop. I was able to take on f6, and after queen f6, plant my bishop on d5, and we reach a very typical kind of Sicilian structure, with d6, e5, and e4, where I have very nice control over d5, and it's really up to black to try and create some counterplay in the position, which is not easy to do given that I have some nice central control. So she plays knight b4, hitting my bishop and my pawn, more importantly my pawn. So I play c3, takes, and now I take with rook. Very important to keep the d file half open. Taking with pawn would solve black's problems, and when I take with rook, this pawn is still a major weakness in the position. So she castles, I play knight f3, and I was feeling very good here because the play just continues to flow very naturally. I'm ready to play rook d1, potentially triple up, and then just try and win the d-pawn. And it's really up to black to figure out either how to defend the d-pawn or try and generate counterplay. And she went ahead and actually played one of the best moves in the position, bishop to g4, going after my knight, also freeing up potential for rook d8 to defend the pawn. And here I went ahead and played queen g5, which is one of the most forcing moves in the position, simply trying to trade queens. And it's very typical whenever you have a just a better structure than your opponent, and your opponent has clear weaknesses, in this case, the pawn on d6, then the more trades that happen, the more glaring the weakness becomes. And I realized we would get into an endgame situation where very, very likely this pawn would fall. So black doesn't have too many options here. If she plays queen e6, I can play knight h2, very strong move, exploiting the bishop, threatening to trap the bishop with f3. So she went ahead, she took, I took. And during the game, I thought I was doing really well here, given that ready to win the pawn or potentially reinforce with rook to d1. However, after the game, I analyzed this with Engine, and to my surprise, Stockfish prefers black here. After a line which I did calculate in the game, but I didn't evaluate correctly, black can take on f3, takes, and then play rook c6. And during the game, I thought, okay, I can play rook d1, and I'm guaranteed to win a pawn, because if rook d8, I thought I could take on e5. This was an incorrect assessment, because if I take, black can play rook dc8, and then all of a sudden my c3 pawn is hit, and my rook is hit, and black is the one playing for a win. On top of that, black could even play a move like king g7 here. And if I go and win the pawn, black gets a lot of counterplay with pawn h4. Now I should note I can't take on a6 because there's a nice move rook d8, preventing my rook from coming back, and this pawn is guaranteed pretty much to promote. So after h4, white can move back with rook d1, but then f6, and black is very quick to activate on the king side. After takes, the king is ready to come in. And it's very typical, especially in rook-pawn endgames, that material doesn't always tell the whole story. And sometimes it's not about how many pawns you have, it's about how dangerous the passed pawns are in the position. This position, black has only passed pawn, which is going to be supported by the king and the rook. I have some pawn weaknesses, and I'm a bit slow to generate counterplay on the queen side. So this is a big missed opportunity for her, but it's hard to blame her. Like I thought this position would be better for me, but it was a type of thing which was hard to evaluate from a distance. So in the game, she played a move which was an attempt to make things really complicated. Pawn to f5. Unfortunately for her, it backfired, and I was able to get a really nice position. Now, my next move, I do have to apologize for, because I know there's a certain community online that is very, very passionate about en passant, and will get very triggered whenever I have a chance to en passant and don't do it. This is one of those positions where en passant is just not a good move. Even though it's possible, pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, this would solve all of black's problems. It would defend this, it would give black counterplay. It's not a move that is good, and I was clearly aware of that. And despite the moral dilemma, I managed to find the actual best move in the position, knight to d2. And this is a very nice positional move because I threaten to play pawn f3, again to trap the bishop. And I also reinforce e4 pawn, meanwhile still attacking d6. And after takes, I found myself with an amazingly placed knight. My knight covers all of my pawn weaknesses while also attacking black's weakness on d6. Also potential for knight f6, where I would get a very, very nice outpost, and it would be very hard for black to remove the knight without sacrificing material. So going forward from this position, I eventually won the pawn, play f3 first, win the pawn on d6, and after takes, rook to d8, She tried to get counterplay along the d-file, but I willingly walked into the pin, played rook d1, supporting my knight. And with this move, I knew that my plan is to play rook d2 and then knight e4 to neutralize the d-file. This is what happened. King f8, rook d2, king e7, and knight e4. And here I was offering the rook trade. If she does decide to take, I would happily take back and then go for the expansion on the queen side and put the knight back on e4. And white is very close to just easily winning from here. So she avoided the rook trade, played rook to c8. And then, unfortunately for black, things got very, very passive. I invaded, she defended, I invaded some more, she defended some more, and we got a situation where it was full domination. These pieces are tied down, very sadly, to the a6 pawn. But I do have to give her kudos, because I thought during the game that I would win by resignation and probably just a few more moves, but she really fought on and tried to stay alive and keep every ounce of hope alive. So it did take work. I played knight to d3, going after this pawn, which can't be defended. She developed the bishop again. I take king g7. I threw in the check, rook b7, king f8, and then I play g4, some attempt to simplify on the king side and make use of my 3-on-2 majority. Then she played a move to try and confuse me, played rook e8, counterattacking my knight. The nice thing for me, I'm up 2 pawns, so I'm happy with trades. I take, takes, take on g5. And even though this pawn looks like a goner, I'm able to counterattack with rook h7. I should note here that g7 may look attractive to some people to try and initiate the rook trade. If I did go for a rook trade, I would be losing here because this pawn is uncatchable. So I have to be careful when the opponent has an outside passer. But yeah, I keep my rook, keep an eye on the h-pawn. She plays king g8, and then I slowly but surely make progress on the queen side. It's very hard for Lac to do anything so active, so I tried to be patient. We traded pawns, and then I brought my rook around, going for rook e6. She played the right move, rook f6, guaranteeing to win the g-pawn. And I'm actually not winning the a-pawn, but because I have a 3-on-2 and her king is so far away from the queen side, it was a pretty routine win. And the way I managed to win this is by making a passy pawn and making sure that her king does not get back to the queen side. So yeah, so I keep the king cut off, and then we entered what is actually a pretty well-known type of endgame, known as the Lucena position. Now, Lucena usually is a position where there's just one pawn and rook versus rook. In this case, there's the 2 extra pawns, but I use very typical Lucena ideas of keeping the king cut off and working my way up with my pawn and my king. And there's not much black can do to actually stop my pawn advance with the rook. She gives a check, I move up, I start pushing, push some more, and then I get my pawn to the 7th rank. Now, one of the key things with knowing how to convert the Lucena position is knowing how to actually promote the pawn. Because if I move to either side, the rook will check. If I move too far away, the rook will come back and keep an eye from behind. So there's a few ways to win this position. The way I was taught when I was a kid is to build the so-called bridge, is to play rook to e4. And it's called a bridge because we have to make shelter for our king. And the rook is going to provide shelter. Now, for those who haven't seen this before, it may not seem so obvious at first. why I put my rook here. But the point is that after, okay, she plays a waiting move. Now I move my king, threaten to promote. Check here, check here. And if she delivers another check, I can play king c5. And after this check, my rook is perfectly placed to block, and her king is just too far away to stop the pawn. And this is the so-called bridge, where the rook is sheltering my king from this check, and be an easy win from here. So in the game, she actually didn't let me build the bridge. She played king f5, attacking my rook, but now I just move to e8, threatening to queen. If she checks, I would actually find shelter behind the a pawn, and yeah, queening is guaranteed. And because of this, she resigned after rook e8. So overall, I'm happy with the game. I think it was pretty clean. There were maybe a couple hiccups in the middle game, but always lessons to take away. And I am happy that I got to play this kind of cool surprise opening that worked out pretty well. So hope you guys enjoyed the two games against the Wu siblings. Stay tuned for more recaps. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you want to analyze on your own, I'll leave a link to the study in the video description. But for now, so long, and I'll see you in the next video.